The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling green mountains of Stowe, Vermont, casting a warm, golden light over the sleepy town. Paul sat on the porch of his old wooden house, sipping his morning coffee, as he watched the mist slowly lift from the nearby lake. This was his favorite time of day, the quiet before the world woke up. But today, the usual peace was tinged with a sense of unease. Paul, a 68-year-old retired musician, had lived alone in this house for nearly a decade. The walls were lined with memories, old records, framed concert posters, and photographs of his younger days on stage. His daughter Anna had moved to the city years ago, and they had drifted apart. The occasional phone call was the extent of their relationship. So when she called last week, asking if her 3 children could spend the summer with him, Paul was taken aback. He hadn't seen his grandchildren in years. Emma, the eldest at 16, was just a shy little girl the last time he remembered. Ben, now 14, had been a curious toddler, always tinkering with things. And Lucy, who was 10, he had never really known at all. The thought of having 3 teenagers in the house made Paul's head spin. He wasn't sure he was up for the challenge. The rumble of an approaching car pulled Paul from his thoughts. He stood up, adjusting his glasses, and saw Anna's SUV coming up the gravel driveway. His heart pounded a little faster. This was it, the reunion he hadn't quite prepared for. The car came to a stop, and the doors flew open. Lucy was the first to jump out, her blonde curls bouncing as she looked around with wide eyes. "Grandpa!" she shouted, running towards him with an infectious energy. Paul managed a smile and bent down to greet her, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in his chest as she hugged him tightly. Ben followed more slowly, his gaze glued to a tablet in his hands. He gave Paul a quick nod before retreating to the back of the car to grab his luggage. Emma was the last to step out. Tall and slender, with dark hair that fell over her eyes, she looked at the house with a mixture of apprehension and indifference. She didn't say a word, just offered a small, polite smile when she met Paul's eyes. "Dad," Anna said as she walked up to him, carrying a heavy duffel bag. Her voice was calm, but there was a hint of tension in it. "Thank you for doing this. I know it's a lot to ask." Paul waved his hand dismissively. "It's fine, Anna. It's just been a while." Anna nodded, understanding the unspoken words. "They're good kids, Dad. They just need a change of scenery." She glanced at Emma, who was still standing by the car, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Especially Emma. Paul's eyes followed Anna's gaze. He could see the uncertainty in his granddaughter's posture, the way she avoided eye contact, and he felt a pang of sympathy. He remembered what it was like to be young and unsure of your place in the world. "We'll figure it out," he said softly. Anna smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'll call when I get back to the city," she said, giving him a quick hug before turning to the children. "Behave and listen to your grandfather, okay?" Lucy nodded eagerly, already tugging on Paul's hand to show her around the house. Ben muttered something that might have been an agreement, but his focus was still on his tablet. Emma just shrugged, not committing to anything. With one last wave, Anna got back into the car and drove away, leaving Paul standing on the porch with 3 grandchildren who felt like strangers. The sound of the engine faded into the distance, and the silence that followed was heavy and awkward. "Well," Paul said, clapping his hands together in an attempt to break the tension. "Who's hungry? I made some pancakes." Lucy's face lit up. "I love pancakes," she exclaimed, dragging Paul towards the door. Ben finally looked up from his tablet, a flicker of interest crossing his face. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Paul chuckled. "Not out here, I'm afraid. But we'll find plenty to do. There's a lot to see around these parts." Emma sighed and looked up at the sky, as if asking the heavens for strength. "Great," she muttered under her breath. Paul pretended not to notice and led them inside. The house smelled of fresh pancakes and maple syrup, a scent that filled the small kitchen with warmth. As they sat down at the wooden table, Paul couldn't help but feel the strangeness of it all, this new family dynamic that had suddenly taken shape. He didn't know what the summer would bring, but as he watched Lucy excitedly pile pancakes onto her plate, Ben examining the old radio on the counter, and Emma staring out the window, he realized that perhaps this unexpected reunion was exactly what they all needed. The sun filtered through the tall pine trees, casting dappled shadows on the gravel path that led from Paul's house to the lake. The house itself was a picture of rustic charm. Its wooden beams, stone fireplace, and creaky floorboards spoke of a time long past. But what was once a lively home filled with music and laughter now felt more like a quiet, forgotten retreat. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Paul had hoped that a hearty breakfast would break the ice, but the pancakes had barely made a dent in the invisible wall separating him from his grandchildren. After breakfast, they had all retreated to their respective corners of the house, leaving Paul alone with his thoughts. Emma had claimed the small guest room at the back of the house, where she could be alone. She spent most of her time lying on the bed, staring at her phone, though the lack of cell service meant she could do little more than scroll through old photos and reread text messages. The isolation gnawed at her. Back in the city, she was always connected. Friends, social media, the bustling life around her. Here, the silence was deafening. Ben had taken over the living room, where he immediately began searching for any hint of a Wi-Fi signal. After a frustrating hour of finding nothing but the old radio and a stack of vinyl records, he gave up and resorted to tinkering with a broken clock he had found in one of the drawers. He was used to having the world at his fingertips, and the idea of spending the summer disconnected from everything felt like a personal prison sentence. Lucy, on the other hand, was determined to make the best of it. She had always been the optimistic one, and the idea of exploring the woods and playing by the lake excited her. She spent her time running in and out of the house, trying to coax Emma and Ben into joining her adventures. But Emma would only shake her head, lost in her own world, and Ben would mutter something about being busy. Paul watched all of this from the sidelines, unsure of how to bridge the gap. He had always imagined being the kind of grandfather who could entertain his grandkids with stories and songs, just as he had done with his own children. But the years had created a distance between them, and now he felt more like a stranger in his own family. The first few days dragged on. Paul tried to engage the kids in different activities, fishing, board games, even a walk through the woods, but the results were always the same. Emma would come along, but with an air of reluctance, barely participating. Ben would grumble and ask when they could go back, his eyes always searching for something to occupy his restless mind. And Lucy, though enthusiastic, couldn't hide her disappointment at their lack of interest. One afternoon, Paul decided to take them down to the lake. The sun was bright and the water sparkled invitingly. Paul had fond memories of swimming there as a boy and later bringing Anna and her brother there when they were young. He hoped it might be the thing to finally bring them all together. Lucy was the first to dive in, her laughter echoing across the water as she splashed around. "Come on, Emma! Ben, it's so nice!" she called out, her voice full of excitement. Emma sat on the edge of the dock, dipping her toes in the water. She smiled faintly at Lucy's joy, but didn't move to join her. Ben stood at the shore, poking at the ground with a stick, clearly uninterested in getting wet. Paul sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He walked over to where Ben was standing and tried to strike up a conversation. "You know, when I was your age, I used to spend hours here. There's a spot across the lake where the fish practically jump out of the water." Ben looked up briefly, then shrugged. "I guess that's cool. If you like fishing?" Paul nodded, unsure of what to say. "Well, it's not just about the fishing. It's about being out here, away from everything. It's peaceful." "Yeah, peaceful," Ben muttered, returning to his stick. Paul looked over at Emma, who was now lying back on the dock, staring up at the sky. He had hoped that this summer would be a chance for her to unwind, to escape the pressures of teenage life in the city. But instead, she seemed more withdrawn than ever. Later that evening, after they had all returned to the house, the tension grew even more palpable. The small kitchen table felt like a battlefield, with everyone retreating into their own thoughts. Paul tried to fill the silence with conversation, but the responses were monosyllabic at best. "So, Emma," Paul began, forcing a smile, "what's your favorite subject in school?" Emma shrugged. "I guess English." Paul nodded, hoping to draw her out. "Do you have a favorite book?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe To Kill a Mockingbird." Paul's face lit up. "That's a great one. I have a copy here somewhere. We could read it together." Emma glanced at him, surprised by the offer. But the moment passed quickly, and she returned to her meal without a word. Ben, meanwhile, was pushing his food around his plate, clearly disinterested. Lucy was the only one who ate with any enthusiasm, though even she seemed to be losing some of her initial excitement. As the evening wore on, the awkwardness became too much to bear. Paul excused himself, retreating to his study where he could be alone with his thoughts. He sank into his old armchair, staring at the collection of vinyl records that lined the shelves. Music had always been his refuge, but tonight even that seemed distant. Outside, the moon rose over the lake, casting a silvery glow on the water. The night was calm, but inside the house, a storm of emotions brewed. Paul realized that if things didn't change soon, this summer could turn into a disaster. But for the first time in years, he felt unsure of what to do. The next few days passed in much the same way. The kids remained distant, each dealing with the situation in their own way. Paul tried to be patient, reminding himself that it was only the beginning of the summer. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing precious time that could be spent building memories, not just passing days. The first rays of morning light filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on the small town of Stowe. The mist that clung to the mountains slowly lifted, revealing the green valleys and winding trails that beckoned to be explored. For the first time since their arrival, the kids found themselves drawn out of the house by something more than just boredom. Lucy, ever the adventurer, had been the first to push for a change of scenery. "Come on, Emma! Ben! Let's go to the farmer's market today!" she pleaded, her eyes bright with excitement. Emma had rolled her eyes, her initial instinct to refuse. But something about the persistent chirping of birds and the fresh air made her reconsider. Ben, too, was reluctant, but the idea of doing anything other than staring at the walls of their grandfather's house was starting to appeal to him. After some cajoling, the three of them finally set off, with Lucy practically skipping ahead. Paul, watching from the porch, felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps this was the start of something new. The farmer's market in Stowe was a colorful affair. Tents lined the town square, filled with fresh produce, homemade crafts, and the enticing smells of baked goods. The locals, a friendly bunch, greeted each other with warm smiles and cheerful hellos. For the kids, it was a different world from the one they knew. "Look at those flowers!" Lucy exclaimed, running over to a stand where bunches of wildflowers were tied together with ribbons. She picked up a bouquet and held it to her nose, inhaling deeply. "They smell amazing!" Emma, still a bit reserved, wandered over to a stand selling homemade candles. The vendor, an elderly woman with kind eyes, noticed her interest. "These are made with beeswax from my own hives," she explained, handing Emma a small lavender-scented candle. "Take a whiff." Emma hesitated but then brought the candle to her nose. The scent was soothing, and for a moment she felt the tension in her shoulders ease. "It's nice," she admitted, giving the woman a small smile. Ben, meanwhile, found himself at a stand selling old books. He wasn't much of a reader, but something about the worn covers and the smell of aged paper intrigued him. As he flipped through the pages of a book on Vermont's history, the vendor, a middle-aged man with a friendly grin, struck up a conversation. "You into history, kid?" "Not really," Ben replied, still scanning the pages. "But this is kind of cool," the man chuckled. "There's a lot of history around these parts. If you're interested, I could tell you about some of the local legends. There's even a spot nearby that's supposed to be haunted." Ben's ears perked up at the word haunted. "Really? Where?" "Not far from here," the man said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But that's a story for another time. If you're curious, maybe you could convince your grandpa want to take you there." Ben nodded, a spark of curiosity igniting in him. For the first time, he felt a pull towards something in this sleepy town. As the morning wore on, the kids found themselves more and more immersed in the market's charm. Lucy chatted with a local beekeeper, asking endless questions about the bees and how honey was made. Emma picked out a few candles to take back to the house, while Ben continued to talk with the book vendor, learning about the area's history. When they finally returned to Paul's house, their arms full of small treasures, there was a noticeable shift in their attitudes. The morning had lifted some of the weight that had hung over them since their arrival. Even Emma seemed more relaxed, her usual frown replaced by a thoughtful expression. That afternoon, Paul suggested they go for a hike. "There's a trail not far from here," he said, trying to keep his tone casual. "It leads to a spot with a great view of the valley." The kids exchanged glances, and to Paul's surprise, they agreed without much hesitation. The trail wound through the forest, the path shaded by tall trees that whispered in the breeze. Paul led the way, his steps sure on the familiar ground. The kids followed behind, their initial reluctance giving way to curiosity as they took in the sights and sounds of the woods. As they walked, Paul began to share stories from his youth. He told them about the time he had camped out in these very woods with his friends, back when he was their age. He talked about the long summer days spent swimming in the lake, the local legends he had heard from the old-timers in town, and the mischief he and his buddies had gotten into. Emma, who had been walking in silence, finally spoke up. "You really lived here your whole life?" Paul nodded. "Born and raised. I left for a while when I was touring with the band, but this place has always been home." Ben, intrigued by the mention of the band, asked, "What was it like being in a band? Did you tour all over?" Paul smiled, memories flooding back. "We did. Played in small clubs, big cities, you name it. It was a wild time. But no matter where I went, I always missed the peace and quiet of Vermont." Lucy, who had been darting ahead on the trail, came running back. "I found something. Come see." They followed her to a small clearing where a cluster of wildflowers bloomed. The view from the edge of the clearing was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below them, with the town of Stowe nestled among the trees, and the mountains rising up on all sides. For a moment, they all stood in silence, taking in the beauty of the scene. The air was crisp, and the sky a perfect blue. It was a far cry from the noisy, crowded city they had left behind. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, almost to herself. Paul looked at her, a gentle smile on his face. "It is. And there's so much more to see." The hike back was lighter, the conversation flowing more easily. Paul told them more about his life, and the kids shared stories from the city. The walls between them, once so high, were beginning to crumble. The next few days were filled with more small adventures. They visited the lake again, this time with Ben and Emma joining Lucy in the water. They explored the town, discovering hidden gems like an old bookstore and a bakery with the best apple pies they had ever tasted. Paul took them to the small town fair, where they rode the Ferris wheel, played games, and indulged in cotton candy. With each passing day, the kids found themselves growing more attached to the simple pleasures of life in Vermont. Emma began to keep a journal, writing down her thoughts and observations. Ben spent more time outside, his tablet forgotten as he explored the woods, and asked Paul about the history of the area. Lucy, always the social butterfly, made friends with some local kids and brought them over to play by the lake. Paul, for his part, felt a sense of renewal. The loneliness that had weighed on him for so long was lifting, replaced by the joy of sharing his life with his grandchildren. He no longer felt like a stranger in his own family. They were building something together, memories that would last long after the summer was over. One evening, as they sat around a campfire in the backyard, roasting marshmallows and watching the stars come out, Emma turned to Paul and said, "I think I'm starting to like it here." Paul's heart swelled with happiness. "I'm glad, Emma. There's something special about this place. I've always believed that." Ben, his face lit by the flickering flames, nodded. "Yeah, it's pretty cool." Lucy, her mouth full of marshmallow, just grinned and gave Paul a sticky thumbs up. As they sat on there, laughing and talking, Paul realized that this summer, which had started with so much uncertainty, was turning into something wonderful. They were no longer just passing the time. They were living it together. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange as Paul sat on the porch, his guitar resting on his knee. The kids were inside, getting ready for another evening by the campfire, their laughter echoing through the house. Paul strummed a few chords, smiling to himself as he listened. The summer had turned out better than he could have hoped. His grandchildren, once distant and unsure, were now filled with a newfound appreciation for Vermont and for him. But as he played, a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. The chords faltered, and Paul's vision blurred. He tried to shake it off, attributing it to fatigue, but the sensation grew stronger, a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. The guitar slipped from his hands and fell to the porch with a dull thud. Inside the house, Emma was the first to notice something was wrong. The abrupt silence outside caught her attention, and she looked out the window to see Paul slumped in his chair, his hand clutching his chest. "Grandpa!" she screamed, rushing out the door. Ben and Lucy followed, their faces pale with fear. Paul was struggling to breathe, his eyes unfocused. I'm fine," he managed to gasp, but the pain in his voice betrayed him. "Ben, call 911. Emma shouted, trying to keep calm. Her heart was pounding in her chest, but she knew she had to stay focused. Ben fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the number. Lucy stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with me, Grandpa," Emma pleaded, kneeling beside him. She grabbed his hand, holding it tightly, as if her grip alone could keep him from slipping away. The minutes felt like hours as they waited for the ambulance to arrive. Emma kept talking to Paul, her voice trembling. "You're going to be okay, Grandpa. Just hold on. Help is on the way." Paul tried to nod, but the pain was overwhelming. He had always been strong, the rock of the family, but now he felt helpless, his strength slipping away. He could see the fear in Emma's eyes, and it broke his heart. When the ambulance finally arrived, the paramedics quickly assessed Paul's condition and loaded him onto a stretcher. Emma, Ben, and Lucy watched in shock as the doors closed and the sirens wailed into the night. Emma insisted on riding with him, while Ben and Lucy followed in their grandfather's old truck, their minds racing with fear and uncertainty. The hospital was a stark contrast to the warmth of Paul's home. The bright fluorescent lights, the sterile smell, and the constant beeping of machines created an atmosphere of cold efficiency. Emma sat in the waiting room, her hands clenched in her lap, while Ben and Lucy huddled together on the couch beside her. Time seemed to crawl. The three of them were too scared to talk, each lost in their own thoughts. Emma replayed the evening over and over in her mind, wondering if there was something she could have done differently. Ben kept glancing at his phone, though he knew there would be no news until the doctors came out. Lucy, usually so full of energy, was eerily quiet, her eyes red from crying. Finally, a doctor emerged from the emergency room, his expression serious but not grim. Emma stood up, her heart in her throat. "How is he?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's stable," the doctor replied, a note of reassurance in his tone. "It was a mild heart attack, but we got to him in time. He's going to need rest and some lifestyle changes, but he's going to be okay." The relief that washed over Emma was overwhelming. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding and nodded. "Can we see him?" "Just for a few minutes," the doctor said, giving them a sympathetic smile. "He needs rest." They followed the doctor down the hallway to Paul's room. He was lying in bed, looking pale and exhausted. But when he saw his grandchildren, a faint smile touched his lips. "Hey there," he said, his voice weak but warm. Emma rushed to his side, tears welling up in her eyes. "Grandpa, we were so scared." Paul squeezed her hand gently. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to scare you." Ben and Lucy came closer, both of them looking shaken. "You've got to take it easy, Grandpa," Ben said, trying to sound casual, but failing to hide the worry in his voice. Paul nodded. "I will, I promise." For a few moments they all stood there in silence, the gravity of what had happened sinking in. The bond they had been building over the summer felt more fragile now, like it could be taken away at any moment. But in that fragility, there was also a new sense of closeness, a realization of how much they truly cared for one another. "I'm going to be okay," Paul said softly, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "We're going to get through this together." Emma wiped away a tear, nodding. "We'll help you, Grandpa. We'll take care of you." Ben, trying to lighten the mood, added, "And maybe we can work on those lifestyle changes together. Less pancakes, more hikes, right?" Paul chuckled, though it made his chest ache. "Sounds like a plan." Lucy, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. "I love you, Grandpa," she whispered, leaning in to hug him gently. "I love you too, Lucy," Paul replied, his voice full of emotion. "I love all of you." The days that followed were a blur of hospital visits, doctor consultations, and adjustments to a new routine. Paul was discharged from the hospital with a strict regimen to follow: medication, a healthy diet, and plenty of rest. The kids took on new responsibilities, helping around the house, cooking meals, and making sure Paul took it easy. Emma stepped up in ways she hadn't expected. She helped with the cooking, making sure they followed the doctor's orders for a heart-healthy diet. She even took up the task of organizing Paul's medication, creating a schedule to ensure he never missed a dose. Ben, always the problem solver, researched ways to keep Paul active without overexerting him, suggesting short walks and light exercises. Lucy became Paul's constant companion, always ready to bring him a glass of water or sit with him on the porch just to keep him company. As they worked together to care for Paul, the bond between them deepened. They learned to lean on each other, to share the burden of worry and responsibility. The experience, though frightening, brought them closer than ever before. Paul, for his part, was humbled by the outpouring of love and support from his grandchildren. He had always been the caretaker, the one who looked after others. Now, in his time of need, he saw a new side of his family, a side that was strong, compassionate, and capable. One evening, as they sat together around the dining table, enjoying a simple but healthy meal, Paul looked at his grandchildren with a deep sense of gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you all," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're family, Grandpa," Emma replied, smiling at him. "We take care of each other." Ben nodded in agreement. "Yeah, and besides, you're stuck with us now. We're not going anywhere." Lucy grinned, her usual cheerfulness returning. "And we'll make sure you stick around for a long time too." Paul chuckled, a warm feeling spreading through him. Despite the scare, or perhaps because of it, he felt more connected to his family than ever before. The summer that had started with so much uncertainty had turned into something more. A time of healing, not just for him, but for all of them. As they sat together, the sun setting once again over the Vermont mountains, Paul knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And in that knowledge, he found peace. The crisp morning air in Vermont was filled with the sounds of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. The mountains, once imposing and distant, now felt like familiar friends, their green peaks welcoming the first light of day. Paul stood on the porch, taking it all in. The house, the lake, the surrounding woods. Everything seemed to shimmer with a new life, a life that had been rekindled, not just in the landscape, but in his heart as well. Paul had spent the past few weeks recovering, following the doctor's orders to the letter. With the help of his grandchildren, he had found a balance between rest and activity, slowly regaining his strength. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped them all during his illness had been replaced by a deep sense of gratitude and a renewed appreciation for each other. Now, with the end of summer approaching, there was a sense of bittersweet finality in the air. But instead of dreading the departure, they all felt a quiet contentment, knowing that they had made the most of their time together. "Grandpa, are you ready?" Lucy's voice called out from inside the house, full of the boundless energy that never seemed to wane. Paul smiled and nodded, though she couldn't see him. "I'm coming, sweetheart." He walked back into the house where Emma and Ben were preparing for their final adventure, a hike up to one of the highest peaks in the area to watch the sunset. It was something Paul had always wanted to do with them, and now, with his health improving and their bond stronger than ever, it felt like the perfect way to close out their summer. The hike began with a steady climb, the trail winding through dense forest and rocky terrain. The kids led the way, their spirits high. Lucy skipped ahead, her laughter echoing off the trees, while Ben, carrying a backpack with snacks and water, kept pace just behind her. Emma walked beside Paul, keeping a watchful eye on him, though she no longer felt the same worry she had in those first days after his heart attack. He looked strong, his steps sure and steady, and she could see the lightness in his expression that hadn't been there before. As they ascended, the landscape around them began to change. The trees thinned out, giving way to open meadows filled with wildflowers and panoramic views of the valley below. Paul paused occasionally to catch his breath, but each time he did, he marveled at the beauty around them, a beauty that now felt intertwined with the memories they had created together. At one point, they reached a small plateau where they decided to rest. Paul sat down on a large flat rock, the sun warm on his face, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine and earth, the scents grounding him in the moment. "This is amazing," Ben said, pulling out his phone to snap a few pictures, though he quickly put it away, preferring to soak in the view with his own eyes. "It really is," Emma agreed, sitting beside Paul. She looked out over the valley, where the town of Stowe was just a tiny speck in the distance. "I'm going to miss this place." Paul turned to her, a soft smile on his face. "You'll always have a place here, Emma. All of you will. This is your home too, whenever you want it to be." Lucy, who had been exploring the edges of the plateau, came running back. "We're almost there, right? The top's just a little further." Paul chuckled, standing up with a groan that was more theatrical than necessary. "Yes, Lucy, we're almost there." With renewed energy, they continued the hike, the trail becoming steeper as they neared the summit. When they finally reached the top, The view took their breath away. The landscape stretched out in every direction, a patchwork of forests, lakes, and distant mountains, all bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon sun. They set up a small picnic on the grassy knoll, sitting together as the sky began to change colors, shifting from bright blue to hues of pink, orange, and purple. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land. And for a while, they all sat in peaceful silence, each lost in their thoughts. Paul broke the silence first, his voice thoughtful. "You know, I never thought this summer would turn out the way it did. I was so used to being alone that I forgot how much I needed this. Needed all of you." Emma, her gaze fixed on the horizon, nodded. "I think we all needed this, Grandpa. I never realized how much I was missing out on until now." Ben, who had been munching on an apple, added, "Yeah, I didn't think I'd ever like it here. But this place, it kind of grows on you." Lucy, always the most expressive, leaned into Paul's side and sighed contentedly. "I wish we didn't have to leave." Paul wrapped an arm around her, feeling the warmth of her small frame against him. "You'll come back," he said with quiet certainty. "And when you do, there will be more adventures waiting for us." As the sun sank lower, they watched in awe as the sky turned a deep shade of red, the clouds glowing like embers. It was a perfect end to a summer that had begun with so much uncertainty and had blossomed into something beautiful and lasting. When the last rays of sunlight finally disappeared behind the mountains, they packed up their things and began the descent back home. The way down was easier, the path familiar now, and their hearts lightened by the knowledge that they had shared something truly special. The next morning, as they packed their bags and prepared to leave Vermont, there was a mix of sadness and anticipation in the air. They had grown to love the simple, quiet life they had experienced over the summer, but they also knew it was time to return to the city and the lives they had left behind. Paul stood on the porch, watching as they loaded the car. The kids moved with a confidence and ease that hadn't been there when they first arrived. They had grown not just in inches, but in understanding and maturity. Emma was the last to finish packing. She walked over to Paul, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "I'm going to miss this place," she said softly, her eyes shining with emotion. Paul reached out and pulled her into a hug. "You'll be back, Emma, and so will I. This place will always be here, waiting for us." Ben and Lucy joined them, and they all embraced, holding on to the moment for just a little longer. The bond they had formed over the summer felt strong, unbreakable, and it gave them the courage to face whatever lay ahead. As they drove away, Paul stood on the porch, waving until the car disappeared down the gravel road. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt lonely. The echoes of laughter, the shared meals, the late-night conversations, all of it filled the space with warmth and life. Paul turned and walked back into the house, a smile on his face. The summer had ended, but a new beginning had taken its place. He felt rejuvenated, no longer the lonely man he had been at the start. Instead, he was filled with hope and the knowledge that his family would always be with him, no matter where they were. And as he sat down with his guitar, the sun rising once again over the mountains, Paul strummed the strings with a sense of peace. The music flowed through the house, mingling with the memories they had created, and he knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in all their lives. Aww.